Hey guys, welcome to section 2 on the Django Scorekeeper tutorial. And right now we're going to talk about creating the models in Django. So for those who don't know what models are what we use to map to the database. Django has a built-in object relational mapper that allows us to just pull records immediately just by using the model.objects query set. So let's go over it real quick. So per the project requirements, per the roadmap, we are building a scorekeeper app so we can add games, scores, and then those can be associated with users. So let's talk about each of these models individually. User info. So we already have users in our database. The reason we need user info is one of the more well-supported ways of extending the user class in Django requires that we create what's called a user info class, and that user info pulls from the user itself, and then we can add on stuff onto there, and that will map to the database. So that's the general best practice as far as extending the user class in Django. Now there are other alternatives to doing that, but that's just the way that we're going to discuss in this particular video. With the user info, obviously we'll have an ID, and then we'll have a games, which will be like a list of the games from that user from that user. I don't think we'll necessarily be able to load it explicitly from that. We may have to query it from the database, and I'll show you guys how to do that. But but just to show the one-to-many relationship, user info will have many games. A game will only have one user. Excuse me. Then game over here, this is a singular event, so we have ID, name, date, and scores. Obviously the ID is for the database, so it's a unique game. Name, date, Jets versus Broncos, date, October, whatever, 2021, and then scores. The scores will be the many scores that we can have. In this particular app, we're going to add functionality to have up to 5 scores. So you could have up to 5 team scores or player scores for each game that we save. So for the score model over on the right here is going to be ID, obviously for the database, then team name and score. Team name is just going to be a string value like a char field as it's referred to in Python. And then score is going to be a decimal value, so like a double or a floating point value. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. I promise it'll make a little bit more sense as we move along, so just stick with it. And let's bring up our Visual Studio. Okay, so editing the models is relatively simple once you get the hang of it. I highly recommend looking at the Django documentation to get started, and also looking at some examples and some templates so you're working from a position of knowledge. But in order to make the model changes, we go into our app, which was generated by Visual Studio. And then we bring this models.python, and then from here you can see we have all of our models in here, and there's nothing obviously because all we have is the default Django authentication. So a couple things we need to add. We're going to have min and max values because so we need a validator, and we also need our user model. So let's import our user model. So we'll go django.contrib.auth.models import user. So this is the user model that we universally use in Django to log people in. And then we're also going to add our validators. So django.core.validators import max value validator, min value validator. Let's see, and those both turn green, so we know it's something that's actually real. So that's fantastic. That looks great. So let's get started. Now, all models in Django have to inherit from models.model, which is referenced right here. So let's first create our user info class. So we'll go class user info, and we'll call models.model. This is how we express inheritance in Python. In C# it would be a little colon. In Java it would be the keyword extends. A bunch of different ways we can do that. But all we need here is what's called a one-to-one field. So we'll go user equals models dot 1 to 1 field user, and then on delete, equals, we'll do models dot do underscore nothing, like that. You can also have it cascade if you prefer to do it that way, but understand a cascade means it's going to delete what you deleted and the related models. So be very careful when you're doing that on the delete. Next will be the game. We're not going to have delete. We're not going to cover delete in this tutorial series. We're just going to cover creating games, logging in, logging out, and that sort of thing. Next, we're going to create games. So we'll call it class game models.model. We represent our inheritance as such. And then we have, I believe it was 3 fields, and then one foreign key, I believe is what we had. So we'll say name equals models.char field, and we'll say we have to define a few things like max length. We'll do max length equals 50, and default equals empty space. You have to define the default if you edit stuff, or if you add blank records, you may need to define a default sometimes because Python will sometimes yell at you. And let's see, date equals models.date field. We can just go ahead and use that as the default. I don't think we really need to extend the date that much. And then number of teams equals models dot, we'll call this a positive, where is the positive integer field? There it is. I don't know why it wasn't showing up. Models dot positive integer field, we'll make the default equals 2, and then we'll add a validators, and this is going to be an array. And then we'll do max value validator, we'll say 5, and min value validator, we'll say 2. So just real quick, explain what this does. Creates a positive integer field. The default is 2, and it must be no greater than 5 and no less than 2 in terms of number of teams. So we're gonna use that a little bit. We don't have to. We could theoretically define the number of teams as the number of scores, or we might not even necessarily have to save it, but it'll be easier to access it on the model itself rather than having to iterate over all the scores and get the count. So finally, let's do game user info equals models.foreign key. And then the foreign key is going to be associated with user info. And then the on delete is going to be do nothing. On delete equals models.do nothing. But again, you can change that based on your preference, based on what you think is a better best practice. Finally, let's come down here and define our score. So we'll go ahead and do class score, inherit from models.model. So what does the score have? ID is obviously a default thing with Django, so you notice we haven't defined ID. Some frameworks, like Entity Framework, you have to actually specify an ID, but you can specify different types of IDs like strings or ints. So we'll go name equals models.char field, and max length equals 50, default equals like so. Pretty simple. Then we'll go score equals models.decimal field. And then what do we need for the decimal field? Well, should probably specify max digits so the person doesn't enter like 80 quadrillion or whatever. So we'll do max digits equals 20, and then decimal places equals 2. So that'll give us 2 decimal places and up to 20 digits. I think that goes well into the billions or trillions or something with that many digits. Nobody's going to get a higher score than that. If they do, they'll get an error. That's okay. I'm fine with that. finally, game equals models.foreign key. And then we're going to do a game on delete equals models.do nothing. And there we go. So that's all of our models. That's everything. So let's go ahead and double check our thing here. And this looks really good. We've got ID, which is Django does that for us. Then we've got games, name, date, scores, team, and score. Name, date, scores, and then foreign key, name and score, game. This looks great. This looks fantastic. I think we're ready to migrate. So let's come down here. Well, did we save? Let's save. Control S. Don't forget the Control S. So let's come down here into our PowerShell console and let's type out Python manage.py make migrations as such. Looks good. So we created 3 models for us, and then let's go Python manage py migrate. Beautiful. So let's check and see what it did. So, oops, sorry. Let's right-click on the DB SQLite 3 or whatever, and let's click on Open With. And then if you have DB Browser for SQLite, that's what I recommend. Click OK. So DB Browser for SQLite. If we bring it over here, we can see we got games, we got scores, and we got user info. The way you differentiate between your custom models and the ones that were created by Django, Django uses auth as a prefix for the stuff that is added from their own auth library, because it's django.auth or django.contrib.auth, one of those. So when you see app, which is what Visual Studio generates for you by default, you know it's your own custom model. So that's kind of cool. And you can see here, all this looks really good. And this is going to be very handy for us later because we're going to need to do filters and sorts and things of that nature. We're going to be able to come over here and grab these records easily by looking into DB Browser for SQLite. And that way we don't have to guess what the fields are. We can just grab them and get going. So it's fantastic. So that's it for this video. We got our models. We are ready to start building out some of the templates and moving some of the data around. So thanks a whole lot, guys, for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.